More than 1,000 years ago, before empires fell and the gods were silenced, the desert of ancient Persia witnessed a war that time nearly erased. They called it the War of the Eternal Sands, a conflict so devastating that the dunes still hold the echo of iron, blood, and prayers whispered among the dead. At the heart of that war, where the sun burned like the judgment of the gods, an ordinary man became a legend. His name was Ardashir of Sarmad, son of a scribe, apprentice healer, and the one who would save hundreds while the world around him burned to ruins. It was the year 482 before the Fall of Arvash. The forces of King Vardanes II fought to contain the invasion from the western kingdoms, which had crossed the Karahan Desert with an army of 40,000 men. The war had already lasted 7 years. Entire peoples had vanished. Cities had turned to ashes. And in the camp of Sarmad, on the banks of the dry Arta River, was the young Ardashir, a man who wielded no sword but carried a satchel with herbs, bronze needles, and blood-stained cloths. On the morning of the final attack, when scouts spotted the enemy's black banners rising on the horizon, Ardashir was kneeling before a body. It was a boy of 15, wounded by a spear the night before. The healer tried to stem the bleeding with myrrh leaves and compresses of damp sand. In the distance, the sound of drums began to swell. It was the signal. The war had arrived. When the first arrows crossed the sky, Ardashir was struck. A stone shard slashed his face. A spear shattered the ground beside his body. Any sane man would have fled to the caves, sought shelter, or waited for aid. But Ardashir did not move. Fire consumed the fields. The roar of catapults mingled with the cries of the dying. He lifted his satchel, wiped the blood dripping from his chin, and ran toward the front, where death had no face. For more than 30 hours, the ancient chronicles say, he tended wounded soldiers, amputated limbs, extracted spears, treated burns with ashes and honey, and saved more than 200 men, many of whom never knew the name of the one who gave them back their lives. Ardashir used what little he had, scraps of torn cloth, boiled wine, olive oil, and ancient prayers taught by his mother. He worked under a rain of arrows, with trembling hands, a feverish body, and an exhausted heart. The writings of the chronicler Hamur recount that, amid the chaos, Ardashir dragged unconscious warriors from the field, carrying them one by one across the dunes, even when his legs could no longer hold him. Wounded, bleeding, and delirious, he refused to stop. "As long as one man is breathing," he told a soldier, "there is something that can still be saved." There was something divine in that desperation. Men swore they saw him walk through the flames as if the fire did not touch him. Others claimed that, around him, the wind ceased for moments, as if the desert storm itself respected his purpose. But when night fell and the battle ended, Ardashir collapsed. The armies had withdrawn. The bodies covered the valley like a carpet of pain. The survivors were gathered, and the healer's name vanished from the records. No general mentioned him. No royal scribe wrote of him. Persia raised monuments to conquerors, but forgot the man who healed with bare hands while the empire bled. For centuries, the name of Ardashir of Sarmad remained hidden. The dune wines erased the footprints, and generations confused him with myth. Only one fragment endured, a broken clay tablet discovered in the ruins of Arta, where it reads, "He wielded no sword, but held back death." Scholars believe Ardashir belonged to the Order of the Healers of Anshan, a forgotten brotherhood of priest-physicians who served on the battlefronts. Their mission was not to kill, but to preserve. And that is exactly what he did, to the limits of the human. The most intriguing part is that his story only came to light more than 1,000 years later, when archaeologists found bones marked with primitive medical instruments and remnants of rare balms used only by royal healers. Among the finds was a copper medallion engraved with the words, "The lives of others are my oath." Today, scholars call Ardashir the Hippocrates of Lost Persia. Others simply call him the forgotten hero of the sands. None know for certain how many lives he saved, nor how he survived so long while wounded. But all agree on one thing. There has never been another like him. The most impressive part is what came after. The war ended with the destruction of Sarmad. King Vardanes was assassinated. The lands were swallowed by sandstorms, and the empire crumbled. Ardashir's name vanished from the books, buried by centuries of silence. But on the banks of the ancient Arta River, peasants still tell stories by moonlight. They speak of a man covered in blood who healed even enemies, of a healer who faced death without sword or shield. And they say that when the wind blows from the east, his voice can be heard among the dunes. Where there is pain, there will be healing. What remains is not just a legend. It is a reminder that true courage wears no armor, seeks no glory, and asks no reward. That sometimes the greatest heroes do not conquer empires, but preserve lives in silence. And so, amid the shadows of time, the name of Ardashir of Sarmad lives on. Not in the annals of kings, but in the memories of those who believe that even in war, the most sacred gift a man can have is the ability to heal. But the story of the War of the Seven Dunes did not end on the battlefield. The silence that followed the men's screams was only the beginning of a new kind of war. The war against oblivion. When the armies returned to their lands and empires began raising their statues of victory, no one spoke any more of the man who had stitched life with his own hands amid despair. The voices of the chroniclers fell silent, and with time, Ardashir's name was swallowed by the desert dust. For centuries, Persian poets and scribes sang of the deeds of kings, generals, and conquerors, but none remembered the healer who, wounded, chose to save rather than destroy. His name did not appear in the chronicles. His face was not on the temple tapestries. It was as if the gods had erased his existence to test the memory of men. But history, like the wind from the mountains of Fars, always returns. And 1,100 years later, an archaeologist named Darius Arvand found something extraordinary in a cave near the ruins of Persepolis. Among rocks, dust, and bones, there was a corroded bronze box. Inside it, an intact scroll written in ancient Aramaic, containing a man's oath. If the world chooses to forget, let the heavens remember. For one act of compassion is worth more than 1,000 victories. The name sealing the scroll was Ardashir, son of Naram, healer of the army of the sun. The discovery shook the academic world. For decades, scholars tried to understand whether this man had truly existed or was a symbolic creation of ancient monks. But the more they dug, the more signs appeared. Inscriptions on walls, fragments of accounts, skeletons in positions indicating attempts at battlefield healing. It was as if, from behind history's shadows, a new face emerged, challenging oblivion. And then, something even deeper happened. Ardashir's story began to awaken not only the interest of historians, but also the soul of modern men. In a world marked by wars, division, and selfishness, the memory of that healer became a symbol of a time when compassion still had courage. Documentaries were made, ancient temples reopened, and pilgrims began visiting the ruins of Shahraz, where it was believed Ardashir had made his last rescue. A small monument was erected in his memory with the inscription, "He who bled to save." And every year, on a date forgotten by calendars, the desert peoples lit torches and gathered under the moonlight to retell his story. Children learned his name as if it were that of a lost prophet, and elders said that on nights of strong wind one could still hear the sound of the hammer and needle he used to close men's wounds. Some believe Ardashir was merely a metaphor, a symbol of the good that resists destruction. Others, however, swear he existed, that his body rests somewhere beneath the sands of Yazd, beside the healing instruments he used in battle. The truth is that his story transcended time. Ardashir was no king, commanded no armies, left no descendants. But he left something greater than all that, the example. In a world that celebrates winners, he chose to be remembered for those he saved. In an empire that glorified power, he proved that true power lies in serving. And perhaps that is why his story took so long to be rediscovered. Because the world is rarely ready to remember the righteous. But when it does, the impact spans centuries. Today, in universities and temples studying ancient Persian culture, Ardashir is remembered not just as a man, but as a symbol. His name is cited alongside philosophers and sages. His oath is studied as a spiritual document, and his life, retold in documentaries, music, and books, inspires doctors, volunteers, and warriors of peace around the world. But Ardashir's true monument is not in stones or words. It is in every act of compassion that arises when a human being decides to heal rather than harm. And when the sun sets over the dunes of ancient Persia, the wind still carries an ancestral memory, the echo of an oath made 1,000 years ago. As long as one heart beats, there will be hope. Wars pass. Empires crumble. The flags that once fluttered in glory now lie torn under the weight of time. But certain stories, those written not on papyrus but in the souls of men, endure. And that of Ardashir, the healer of the War of the Seven Dunes, is one of those stories. They say time erases everything, that even mountains turn to dust. But there is something that not even 1,000 years of oblivion can destroy: the trace of kindness. Because when it is true, it becomes part of the very structure of the universe. Ardashir did not fight for victories. He fought for lives. In an era where death was the language of empires, he chose to speak the language of healing. And perhaps that is why he was forgotten, because the world always remembers first those who destroy, before those who save. But when the empires fell and the kings of gold turned to ash, his name returned, carried by the wind. Today, when archaeologists study his inscriptions, when historians analyze his symbols, and when monks recite his oath in the mountains of Iran, it is as if the spirit of that healer still walks among us. Some claim he was just a man. Others say he was the reflection of something greater, a divine sign sent to humanity to remind us that, even in the greatest darkness, the light of compassion never fades. And perhaps that is the true lesson of the story, that every civilization, no matter how grand it seems, will be judged not by its temples or its wars, but by how it treated its wounded. because every generation faces its own war of the 7 dunes. Sometimes not with swords, but with words, with ego, with indifference. And in each of those battles, there is always an Ardashir, someone who chooses to heal while the world destroys, someone who bleeds to save, someone who rises when all fall. The name changes, the face changes, but the spirit remains. And that is why, more than 1,000 years later, amid silent ruins and dunes that still whisper ancient tales, the legend of Ardashir lives on. Because the men who kill write history, but the men who heal write eternity. And when the last stone of the last empire falls, when the last king is forgotten, the echo of a simple healer will still be heard in the wind, reminding the world that true victory was never in strength, but in love.